is my honor to welcome everybody here to today's Medical Alley webinar titled Power for Patients, How Advancements in Medical Device Power and Energy Are Driving Healthcare Innovation. My name is Ben Wagner. I am the Associate Director of Communications here at Medical Alley, and I am delighted to be your host for today's webinar. First of all, what a great day to hold an event indoors. If you're with us, coming to us from Minnesota today, the temperature is a balmy -10 with a wind chill of -35. So I appreciate everybody for logging on today, especially those of us who are in the Twin Cities, but around the world as well. First, I want to give a big thank you to Resonant Medical for making this webinar possible and really shining a light on such innovative and transformative technology. Resonant Medical provides fast, safe, and convenient wireless power for medical devices that go on or inside the body to ensure that patients are able to get well and to stay well wherever they are. And you'll hear more about Resonant Medical from the company's CTO and co-founder, who is with us as a panelist here today. Today's webinar will focus really on what's the latest trends here in implantable medical technology, the advancements that are driving in power and energy, really, that are making devices smaller, smarter, and less invasive. So from next generation batteries to wireless charging breakthroughs, innovation here really is unlocking new possibilities in patient care, safety, and ultimately in quality of life. So with that, I am delighted to welcome our panelists with us here this morning to share their expertise and their perspectives. With us today is Chris Bullock. He is the CEO and co-founder of QV Bioelectronics. Also here with us today, Bryan McLaughlin, the CEO at MicroLeads, and finally, Aaron Stein, the Chief Technology Officer and the co-founder of Resonant Medical. Aaron, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself. Tell us a bit more about your work at Resonant Medical as well.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be talking to everyone here today. As Ben said, my name's Aaron Stein. Founded Resonant back in 2017. It's been 8 years and a fantastic journey. And Resonant is really focused on helping bridge the gap between inside and outside the body, helping deliver fast, safe, and efficient power through the skin into devices. We continue over and over to see this trend of devices trying to get smaller. We see devices getting more and more power hungry. And as those trends continue to progress, being able to safely deliver power into those devices becomes more and more critical. And that's what Resonant is here to help you do. And excited to talk about that a bit more in the context of this panel as well. Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben.
Aaron, thank you. Chris, I'll turn it over to you next.
Good morning, everyone. Chris Bullock, as Ben said, I'm the CEO of a company called QV Bioelectronics. It's a startup based in the UK. We're developing an active implantable medical device for the treatment of brain tumors using electrical fields. So our device looks a lot like, neuromodulation systems and existing systems, but we're kind of applying that to a completely new target, a new field of medicine. And as a result, we've come across quite a few technical challenges in that process as well.
Thank you, Chris. And finally, Bryan. And unfortunately, Bryan, you are on mute.
How about that? Just testing. Good morning, everyone. Bryan McLaughlin, founder of MicroLeads Medical. We're based in Boston. And I had the privilege for several years of working alongside as GSK's engineering director, looking at many of the problems of very small and low energy devices. And so at MicroLeads, we're developing kind of methods to get energy more efficiently into the nervous system. So that is kind of self-expanding leads that are injected, specifically focused around peripheral nerve stimulation in chronic pain and obstructive sleep apnea.
All right. Bryan, Chris, Aaron, thank you all for being here. And so let's get into kind of our questions here. And we'll start with a question really for everybody. Broadly, with advancements in medical device technology. Chris, I'll start with you. What are some trends in medical device design that you are particularly focused on right now, and what are some of those trends that you think are here to stay?
I mean, it's a very broad question, but I would say a few things. Firstly, I think a lot of companies have quite a commercial focus in their design and development now. So, actively designing features and parts of their device with reimbursement and a business model in mind. I think traditionally things were very focused on user need and the clinical problem, and I think people are now adding that commercial focus into their design focus, from the very early stages as well. And kind of tied to that, a lot of the biggest players have been starting to cut back on some of their R&D. I think that the focus on new product development is shifting more and more to small companies and startups. And as venture-backed startups, we're always operating with a potential exit in mind. And in medical devices, most commonly that's through acquisition. So if you're in my shoes, and I don't know, maybe Bryan will agree or maybe not, and you're designing a new product, then we are also thinking about the kind of product profile that our potential acquirers would want as well. So thinking about their business model, how they operate and how this could integrate alongside their existing product offerings. And that's a key part to having a sustainable business proposition, which I know is not an engineering answer at all. So I will give you a science one as well that isn't just about money. I think more and more medical devices are becoming smart in some way. So we're looking at ways of getting data out of devices that previously weren't networked and weren't providing data back to the companies. And when you do that, I think that opens up a range of possibilities, both in terms of business opportunities, but also convergence between what historically have been fairly separate industries. So, if you've got new data, then that may open up partnership opportunities with healthcare providers or with other industries like pharmaceuticals. And generally medical devices and all medical technology, I think, are gradually merging together to make a more holistic ecosystem.
Bryan, anything you would add to that? What sort of are the trends that you're particularly focused on right now?
Yeah, so I agree with the strong need for any early device to really align well with both your own commercial strategy, but potential kind of early acquisition and sort of a next generation device that maybe has features that current PMA or 510K products may not have. So everybody talks a lot about closed loop devices, and in Neurostim, that typically there's been probably two devices. One was NeuroPace for seizure detection, and then kind of trying to abort a seizure. And then in spinal cord stim, there's been a device that tries to detect when you're laughing or coughing or you're sort of having some aberration, and then it dials back or turns up the therapy. And so there have been kind of some encouragements like that that have really kind of propelled people to hoping for the next wave in Neurostim. And so I think a lot of excitement around closed loop devices, anything that helps physicians reduce their burden, reduce the amount of time that, sadly, the time that they have to spend with the patient, or the companies themselves needing to hassle with the patient. So they kind of they prefer a technology that is set and forget, as opposed to one where the company and its reps have to be, I don't know, debugging with the patient all the time. And so I think, to wrap a bow on all of those features take energy. They take battery size. And so there's kind of this tension in the industry where we want devices with more features, but on the flip side, we actually want them to be less invasive and minimally invasive and not such a big surgery to scale to larger populations. So I think there is a tension right now between those two features.
Aaron, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just agree with both of what Bryan was saying and what Chris was saying. I think basically you see the increased need for data and means you need more processing, more communications. That means more power, right? Bryan's talking about closed loop devices. That means, again, you need more processing, more power. And so you have this kind of fundamental need to get more power into the body so that you can process and do the work that you need to do. At the same time, we have these kind of like timeless imperatives that have always impacted implantable medical devices, right? The smaller the device, the better the patient experience is going to have, and the longer the lifetime that the device is going to have, the more the better the patient experience is going to be there as well. We don't want to be having unnecessary, dangerous, and expensive surgeries as well. And so I think that, like, from a technology perspective, we see each of those different trends like just funneling up to this kind of like mass push from being at primary cell batteries into secondary cell batteries. Secondary cell batteries, enable you to go smaller. You start to have that recharge process, but you can have devices that last longer. You don't have to replace them you don't have to replace them because the battery's dead. And they now allow you to do things like closed loop, like processing, and help take those devices to that next level feature set that both Bryan and Chris are talking about.
Bryan, I'll come back to you kind of with this next question. Really, what kind of conversations are you having with clinicians who are recommending and implanting these devices? Like, what specifically are the end users asking for today from these devices?
No, that's a great question. My colleagues and I have done pretty deep dives across, as I mentioned, peripheral nerve pain, so like knee pain, shoulder pain. We've done a lot of work in sleep apnea as well, around what is needed there. And I think I mentioned or touched on one of them briefly, and that is, I've had a physician say one time that we're still in kind of the MySpace websites when everybody else in the world moved on to Instagram. And so a lot of the devices that we have, I think fundamentally are too large. And so there's kind of a scalability issue with, getting more than, say, 20,000 implants of a peripheral nerve stimulator per year, right? Whereas cardiac kind of moved on. Neuromod is still relatively small in the number of procedures per year. And so everybody tends to view invasiveness as something that is kind of an obstacle for patients. So that would be one area. The other one I touched on briefly, and that is physicians kind of want to do a procedure and be done and not have a huge maintenance burden. And so if you make a product or there are some, no diss on wirelessly powered devices, but there are some out there right now that you have to wear kind of a knee brace 24/7. And then if the coupling isn't very good, the patients just get frustrated and they give up. And at the end of a trial, they report that, the therapy didn't work very well. Well, they probably weren't using it all the time because of the kind of frustrations. And so a lot of physicians have really started to push back on maybe what I would call inconvenient therapies that put a burden on the patient that, I don't know, mitigates them wanting to use it effectively.
Chris, are you seeing kind of a similar frustration in your conversations with clinicians?
Yes and no, and apologies that my automatic lights have just gone off there, but hopefully everyone can still see me. So I would say in neuro-oncology, we have horrific clinical outcomes. So what feedback do I get from our surgeons and oncologists that we go and speak to? I mean, first and foremost, they want a treatment that works. And we have that as our context. But putting that to one side, I agree with almost everything that Bryan has just said. Perhaps that's not the best for a panel discussion. A bit of contention usually makes for a more interesting conversation. But ease of use of medical devices, I think, is really important. Just in almost any healthcare intervention, compliance with the treatment has an enormous impact on how effective it's going to be. And as Bryan has been rightly saying, if you've got devices that are cumbersome, require a lot of intervention, both from the patients and physicians, patients having to travel into hospital very regularly for different, changes of settings and so on, then it just limits the willingness of patients to comply with those treatment regimes. And that has an enormous impact, probably more so than almost any other factor on how effective interventions often are. So if as designers we can find ways of making systems more user-friendly, reducing those contact points, as Bryan's talking about, then it does make a big difference in terms of the end effect, which everyone wants is better healthcare outcomes.
And Aaron, we've kind of set the foundation for this conversation here with some of the trends and problems that clinicians are seeing. And obviously power and energy are major factors in how medical devices are designed. I wonder if you could share a bit more about what's possible with newer medical device power and battery technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to build one thought on the last conversation,
Yeah,
that I'm going to answer
please
that
do.
question directly. Yeah, the other thing, I think, the treatment has to work, and then it's all about reducing the burden on patients so that working with that device is as smooth as possible. I think we talked about it from, typically, or there's also a group of patients that we see there where fine motor control, isn't great, and like interfacing with devices is just difficult. So there's like that barrier of what reducing the burden on the patient means can really be fluctuating depending on kind of that specific device that you're interfacing with. And so reducing charge times, reducing alignment, making that whole thing simple so that people can get their devices operating good to go in as quick as time as possible so they can go back to living their lives is really critical. And where that bar is can be really different depending on the specific device and patient that you're treating. Sorry for taking a step back there, Ben. Answering your question about kind of the direction of technology. I think the trends that we're seeing, the high level kind of trends that we started talking about, have been kind of pushing the field in a particular direction. So I think as devices get smaller, they get more power hungry. We're seeing this push to secondary cell. As we get to secondary cell, that charge experience and reducing that patient burden becomes really, really really important. And so that means there's a push for having fast charge times and flexible alignments so that you can get patients on with their day and you don't have to be finicky with that particular device. In order to make that come to fruition, you really need two critical things to be happening. One is that we are going with smaller batteries, but we always have talked about historically energy density as being a critical aspect of a battery spec. I think we're increasingly seeing C rate, or how fast you're able to safely charge that battery while maintaining a good cycle life, is increasingly become important. And I think we've seen many of the different battery suppliers are taking steps to continue to push the bounds on what's achievable for C rate, because that's what enables us to do things like 20-30 minute recharge times and reduce that patient burden. At the same time, that has to get paired with things like high performance charging. And so the demand for higher power charging devices to help recharge those batteries and power the communication and other aspects that we talked about as being increasing that power burden is also a trend that we've seen as well. So I think both of those things working in concert is helping lift us up towards the next generation of implantable devices.
And Aaron, I'll stick with you kind of here for this next question too. And obviously size has been a major constraint for medical device power up until now, particularly the size of primary cell batteries. How do you see battery technology limiting or not limiting what medical devices can do today?
Yeah, I mean, if you take apart almost any implant, and batteries are 30-50% of what's inside of the can that you see today. So it's reducing the size of batteries is one of the fundamental challenges we have in terms of making the types of implant that Bryan was talking about. I think the challenge is that there are more advanced chemistries out there that are going to increase energy densities 10-20% from where we're at today. But I don't think there's, or at least nothing on the horizon right now, where we're talking factor of 2, factor of 5, and fundamentally altering the devices. And I think that's what's really pushing people from primary cell to secondary cell. It's like, okay, well, if the energy density is approximately fixed based on the chemistries, then let's make the battery a quarter as small as today, get to 20-minute recharge once a week. And we're going to be able to make this device much smaller and still have a very low charge burden on that patient. And I think That's why people are so excited about secondary cell batteries, is it helps break that kind of fundamental limit that on energy density that's been holding back device size for more than a decade.
Bryan, I wonder what your take is on this about the size of batteries and primary cell batteries and the limiting factors or the non-limiting factors of what devices can do today.
Yeah, I mean, the battery market and the size per unit time, and this may be controversial, but usually it's about 10% per year in battery volume reduction. And I would say medical device, implantable device batteries, because of their safety, tend to lag behind a little bit, maybe where, I don't know, drone charging batteries and other things might be. So we kind of catch technologies a bit later because they have to go through so much more rigor. So batteries tend to dominate implant size. Antennas, you can't really reduce their size effectively. So there's kind of some long poles in the tent that push you to try to reduce other things like header size and ASICs to reduce your circuit size. The problem gets harder, and you begin to have to kind of squeeze on everything to get your implant size down. One of the areas that we have focused on a lot is actually in the business end of every implant. So I would argue that neuromodulation is about the most inefficient therapy that's ever been developed in terms of like getting energy into the nervous system. So I don't know a good example of this, but if you're trying to find, I don't know, the locker room in a stadium, what you really need is probably a flashlight to kind of find the thing. But instead, we turn the whole stadium lights on to try to basically find the therapy. And so it's kind of an inefficient system. And what I mean by that is, every injectable, maybe with the exception of deep brain stimulation, we put a device in, it stimulates like a big, glow ball, and therapy kind of goes indiscriminately every which direction. And so you lose probably 70% of that off target, somewhere you don't want it and somewhere that it's not doing any good. And that's where we've spent a lot of time kind of trying to provide the energy efficiency that, say, a nerve cuff does in, say, vagus nerve stimulation, but where you can deliver that basically non-surgically and get sort of that 180-degree coupling where you save at least half the energy that a traditional nerve stimulator would apply. So we're trying to save it kind of at the business end where you don't lose it, where therapy is delivered, and then also that affords you some flexibility to just cut your battery size down significantly, et cetera.
Precision, I imagine, is key. Chris, you're developing a novel device. I'm curious, how do you go about determining how much power specific therapies need? Kind of touching off of Bryan's last point, especially when it's new or next generation therapy.
Yeah, great question. And the answer is it's not easy, and it's not a linear process. In our case, we're translating a new form of treatment. We've got it working in the lab, and now we're in the process of moving that forwards into patients. So how did we go about that? Well, firstly, we've spent years developing the therapy and the effective stimulation regime to get this working in the lab. And we've built computational models of exactly how the energy is being delivered in our cancer models. And then we scale that from there into models of the human brain. So trying to understand how the electrical energy flows to generate exactly the same effect in the human brain that we've got working preclinically. But that's not the end of the story of calculating the energy, because when you've achieved that, you've then got to design your ASICs and your circuitry to deliver that. And of course, your device design is going to consume a significant amount of your energy as well. So, and then it kind of enters an iterative phase where, as Bryan's talking about, you're trying to optimize that delivery of treatment effect, biological effects in your target. You're trying to optimize the design of your device. And I think generally speaking, everyone is trying to save energy where they can and avoid wastage. Wastage it's typically heat in these devices, and that's very often one of the limiting factors in terms of how hard you can push the therapy. In cancer, we often get compared to chemotherapy, right? There's a kind of a dosing limitation on chemotherapy before you start having these toxic effects, and heat is kind of the same thing for us, and I think that's true of a lot of devices. And just to round this off, Bryan's absolutely right that across all of these therapies, there's a huge amount to be done on the biological end. If we understand the mechanisms better, we can target them better, we can be more focal in the treatment. Fundamentally, I'd say the biggest problem we face in the brain is that nobody really understands how the human brain works. So we're just kind of using Bryan's flashlight analogy, where we're looking at a tiny beam of light shining around the completely dark stadium and trying to understand its full structure and how that works, and that's not easy.
I think that's a good analogy that Bryan made there too. And Aaron, so when medical device teams come to you, what's that conversation like? Do they always know how much power they may need for their device? How do you handle designing a wireless power system when you may not know all of the final device specifications?
Yeah, I think it really varies where a founder or a product leader is in their product journey, right? Like typically, if you're trying to do something novel, important with a big impact, you're starting on a whiteboard. It's something like 5-8 years later, maybe a little shorter if you're lucky. You have a final product and you have the final answer to the question of how much power do I need? And like the engineering process that many of us are going through is really about risk reduction and helping answer those questions methodically along the way. And so, we see folks all along kind of that different journey. We see things all along that journey. I think the key to making good architecture decisions about your product is kind of going into that wherever you are in that journey, kind of with your eyes wide open. So we try to provide answers, for example, of what's feasible in your product as a function of key variables. For higher power devices like closed loop devices, that might be solving feasibility as a function of power so that you can say, hey, if we need this much power, this is how big it needs to be. If we need this much power, we can make it this much smaller, so that you can use that to help scope and think about your devices. And that's a very common approach that we take with people earlier on in that process who have ballpark numbers maybe of where they need to get to, but certainly don't have that locked in. I think on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes you have devices that, have gone through, developing a wireless charging system. Maybe they built a wireless charging system and now it's getting too hot or not meeting EMI compliance. And you have a pretty well-defined product, your power budget, but like, hey, I just have this power problem if I can't get my device to market because, my coils are getting too hot and I need a path forward. And there, with that group of folks, you end up seeing very defined power specs, and you're much more focused on how can I integrate this into the architecture and design decisions that have already been made. And so it's really throughout that entire spectrum of folks that we're excited and able to help in their journey.
Bryan, Microleads developed the first programmable electrode for position therapy. I wonder if you could explain the difference really between your programmable electrode and standard electrodes, and then maybe thinking more broadly about what this may mean for future devices. And Bryan, you're on mute there again.
Sorry, there we go. Yeah, so by programmable electrodes, going back to the stadium analogy, we kind of try to deliver therapy one stadium light at a time with everything else essentially turned off. So rather than kind of, lighting up lights all around, we sort of pick and choose. And so there are two things that we have discovered you really need, particularly for a lot of these peripheral nerve targets that you can't see, right? The physician doesn't have a camera. We don't want an open incision. And so if you're putting a device in blindly, then they need to be able to kind of pinpoint in a dark space that they don't know what's going on inside. And so that's where having multiple contacts over a larger area allows the physician to kind of move the therapy around and sort of optimize it. So we published a clinical study with a 60 electrode device in spinal cord stim with Dr. Politsis last August. But then in the last, 18 months or so in kind of stealth mode, we've been working on an injectable device. So that goes in with a needle, and much like a stent, that will open up near a peripheral nerve, providing that kind of array of electrodes that help you have access to different treatment areas, and then you can turn them on individually. So again, why do we do it individually? We're just trying to save the energy, find the 1 or 2 electrodes that really provide maximal dosing, and then everything else just gets turned off.
Excellent. Another question here, kind of really more to the entire group here. As devices get smarter, how are you thinking about data processing and communications? And has it changed your approach to development? Chris, I think I'll start with you on that kind of broader question.
Well, as we've been discussing throughout this webinar, I think the current technology can be very limiting in terms of what your devices can do: power demands, size, heat generation. So generally, we try and do the data processing off implant. You just dump the raw data. That can be a way of basically moving the more energy intensive processes elsewhere. But in so doing, you do kind of limit that ability to do kind of really smart closed loop treatments. So it is a design choice that is based on current hardware, but Bryan very eloquently set out all the benefits of truly closed loop treatment earlier. And if you take that approach, then you can't have fully autonomous devices. It requires patients to come in and download that data. Clinicians then have got to make decisions with it. So it does change the usability of the device in that way. But I feel, with design pragmatism in mind of kind of getting these features functional in devices now, that's often the easiest way because of the hardware limitations.
Aaron, anything you'd like to add there?
I just agree with Chris. I feel like, with power, I think we have, inductive power is kind of the path to getting power into the body consistently, safely, and with recent innovations, quickly and flexibly. I think on communications, there's a bunch of technologies that kind of work, but have kind of fundamental drawbacks. Like we see people use Bluetooth. You have security concerns and bandwidth limitations. You try to push to Wi-Fi for higher bandwidth and your power consumption goes through the roof, or you try to use LEDs or optical links and you have pretty significant implant depths. And so we see, kind of optimization of different communication approaches for a particular device to help bridge that gap that Chris is talking about, get the data out so you can process it outside the body as best you can. And there's a lot of work to do, I think, in bridging that communications gap in a much cleaner, more efficient way so that it can help, just drive better devices. Until I think, there's answers there, but there aren't slam dunk answers. And so then it comes down to, if we're going to be processing inside the body, how can we make sure that we're doing that as effectively as possible? I think those are kind of the two different worlds that people are living in today.
Bryan, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, I mean, to dig down a level of detail, implantables have not been that smart at the end of the day, right? So most implants today are fielded with an MSP 430, which is almost expired. You can barely get those things. And some people are moving on to, STM32s, they're basically pretty limited computation cycle device or, MCUs essentially. And so the amount of processing that you can really do is basically quite limited, which is why, as Chris was saying, they send the data out to have something else do it. It's not a bit like, I feel like the opportunities for doing big data and AI on a little 32-bit or at most 32-bit microcontroller is just kind of tough. I mean, we need these implants to be running 40 microamps average current is a typical spinal cord stimulator. and your Bluetooth chips alone are going to be running at, I don't know, 4 milliamps when they're transmitting. So you got to keep them shut off most of the time. So everything is like, squeezing a water balloon. You got to, really be pushing at every corner of the circuit to keep things off, or otherwise the patient's just having to kind of recharge constantly. One of the things, though, that it seems kind of incremental, but the cardiac world has a little, alarm clock that sits beside your bed. And when you're asleep at night, it's dumping little bits of data, and then the alarm clock sends it off to the cloud, and then there's some physician monitoring that happens. And so that we're starting to see as a new wave for neurostim. So a couple companies are kind of getting to that, where you can either remotely call the data and just look at it. And there's only one company that I know of that can like remotely program the device. So if you're on vacation and I don't know, the device therapy isn't working, you could technically go to a call center and then, try to basically access the device and reprogram it. So those are a few of the trends, but they all take power, and we're just not in a good corner of the world for big data processing and power.
Chris, I wanted to follow up to this question with you, and specifically your device designed to slow the growth of cancer tumors, specifically for glioblastoma. And like with ultrasound, you actually use electricity as part of the therapy, not just for power. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on how that works and why this could be helpful for difficult to treat neuro-oncology indications.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are using an established mechanism of action for treating these cancers. So there is an existing product on the market that has quite compelling clinical data supporting the survival benefit from this approach. But a little bit like we've been talking about earlier, that product is external to the body, has some limitations in terms of patient compliance that can impact the end effect of the treatment. So what we're doing is developing a surgical implant that's more usable, and we believe will improve the end efficacy of the treatment in that approach. So in terms of exactly how it works, essentially we deliver high amplitude, intermediate frequency electrical fields, and when you deliver fields in this kind of range, you have this direct anti-mitotic effect. So you literally interfere with the process of cancer cells pulling themselves apart from each other. And because these cancer cells are genetically programmed for infinite division, as soon as you stop them from doing what they want to do, which is this division process, you actually end up pushing them into what's called apoptosis or cellular suicide. So it's a way of killing the cancer cells non-ablatively, so it's non-harmful to the healthy brain tissue that doesn't go through these same dividing processes. But to deliver this effectively from an implant, our challenge really is about power. We have a high power application compared to most neuromodulation devices. The amplitude is higher, and we also have a lot of channels. We're trying to generate this effect over quite a large area. It's precisely the opposite of Bryan's kind of laser guided missile approach. It's more of a kind of B-52 carpet bomb of the area where these cancers are. But that's what we need to do to generate this effect over a big area, and I think have a really meaningful impact in survival for these patients.
I really appreciate the imagery, by the way, of the analogies that are being provided.
Maybe I shouldn't have gone down the military analogy for healthcare. I mean, we're in the business of saving lives, not taking them. But anyway,
effective nonetheless. Yeah, Chris, thank you. Aaron, a question next is for you. What are some? I wonder if you have any specific examples of a new kind of device that is enabled by better wireless power and battery technology that maybe wasn't previously possible. More broadly thinking, like what are you excited about in this space?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two classes of device that I think, next generation wireless power is having a big impact on. I think one is the kind of ultra miniaturized devices that are doing monitoring inside the body. So we see smart stents, we see devices that are doing blood pressure monitoring. And the fundamental challenge there is that they're really deeply implanted. They need a small amount of power, but they're very far away from where those transmitters are coming. And so, being able to push to up to 10 centimeters of implant depth with some of the farthest chargers that Resonant Link has built has really enabled kind of that new class of small monitoring devices that help get ahead of, where issues get information to clinicians when patients are having issues and when they're at high risk. And I think that's a really exciting development. I think the other one that Bryan touched on is just closed loop neurostim. I think that's kind of the future in terms of providing more targeted therapies for patients so that it can help solve the challenge at hand and nothing more. And so, those are more power hungry applications. And so having faster charging so that charge burden, as we talked about early on, is really low, is a big place that we're seeing fast charging and new wireless charging technologies have a big impact on the next generation of devices.
I've got one more question really here for our panel, and just a good time to remind everybody who is listening in to start putting some of those questions into that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We've got a couple that have already come in, and we'll make sure we get that to our panelists here in just a moment. But to kind of close out the moderated part of this discussion really is, one of the benefits of recharging devices are longer lasting, which might change the business model for some devices and affect reimbursement. I wonder if this group could elaborate maybe on how you see this evolving. Bryan, I wonder if I could start with you on that.
Yeah, a couple thoughts as it applies to reimbursement. There was, at least in pain treatments today, there were pre-1976 RF powered devices. And so a lot of companies, when they go to market, they can get a 510(k) clearance. And so they immediately go to a battery-free kind of wirelessly powered device because they can cite, earlier devices. And so, that has provided a rapid market access approach. And to come back to your question on reimbursement, those have been around for probably more than a decade at this point, the sort of Gen 2s or Gen 3s of those. And I think those devices have really struggled in pain stimulation to get a very crisp and a clear reimbursement for a number of reasons. Some of it's efficacy, some of it is those sorts of issues. And so there has kind of emerged where you get paid better, at least in the US, for a battery an implant that contains a battery. The payment is stronger for any number of reasons. And so, it's kind of a trade-off of, do you want to get to market faster? Do you want to take a longer, more of a PMA path to get your device approved, but then basically get paid better per procedure? And so, I don't know, it's a big deal when physicians have a hard time getting paid. They're not wanting to put your device in. So it's kind of this complicated area of your go-to-market strategy of basically making it easy for the physicians to actually get paid. So I do think that devices that last longer, whether it's, I would say longer between charges perhaps, is sort of a key thing that's emerging where there's just less patient burden, less physician burden. And then maybe one quick comment, some of the companies don't like necessarily to have a device last 20 years as opposed to, say, 8 years, because technology moves on. A patient wants the latest and greatest, or they want Bluetooth to connect it to their phone instead of having to use some custom remote. So a lot of people don't want something that lasts forever per se. They kind of want to get upgraded at some point. And the companies also secretly like those upgrades because they make a lot of money when they replace an implant. So there's a little bit of a tension there in the business model and sort of the, a device that just never breaks.
Mm-hmm. Chris, any other insight you'd care to share?
Yeah, I was thinking along similar lines to what Bryan just finished off with there. I mean, if you have these primary batteries that have a limited lifespan, and with existing systems, after a few years, patients come in, they can have an implant swap. As Bryan's saying, that's a kind of a money maker for the companies. They're selling a second implant, or at least a second battery. So it's a second bite of the reimbursement cherry off that patient. There's definitely been a push in healthcare in general, all technologies, for more kind of outcome-based pricing. In healthcare, we always look at kind of median outcomes. That there's no certainty in exactly how one patient is going to respond to an intervention. It's always going to be a kind of normal distribution. Some see great effects, others less so. So when you've got a high cost device that you're just paying for upfront, you're asking the payers and the clinicians to take on that risk. And so I think over the last couple of decades, there's been this push to kind of find ways to spread the cost out. And one of the ways that implant companies have done that is to say, well, okay, we may not get quite so much off the first purchase, but then subsequent interventions, we're going to make up our revenue on that patient. But if we're now moving into an area where, rightly, we're going to these rechargeable batteries, and patients aren't going to have these interventions to replace the primary batteries, then it does mean that business model is going to have to shift again. It's going to have to be some way, whether it's kind of consumable elements involved in the charging or something, but for businesses to find new ways of getting spreading out their revenue to meet that demand from the payers, and also make sure that they've got a sustainable business.
Aaron, I'll give you kind of the final word, and before we jump into some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think the perspective that Chris and Bryan are both sharing there makes a lot of sense. And I think the only thing that I just want to add to that is that there's a couple different ways to think about generating revenue off of that particular device, and kind of maximizing for that individual patient is one thing. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the other way to think about that is, if you say kind of relentlessly focused on that patient experience, that's going to kind of naturally take you into kind of a driving market share and increasing the number of people that are willing to accept that therapy, and the number of people and the number of devices you have in comparison to your kind of competitors out there. So, keeping in mind that the better devices we can have, the better outcomes we can have, the better patient experience that we can have there, is really going to help grow the overall pie that we're all playing with. And is like another way to like focus that, rather than like, hey, like, rather than focus that on like a person, if we focus on the like broad community that we can serve, you might get to slightly different outcomes or decisions on how you make that device as well. So just an alternative way to think about it a little bit as well.
I think a good question here to start with is a question about MRI compatibility. The question is, what are expectations for MRI compatibility, and are there unique challenges associated with wireless power components when it comes to MRI safety?
A question that we get a lot here as we design a bunch of different systems. I think being safe within MRI is a very common request, and there are a lot of devices out there today that can do that. I think essentially the big challenge there is making sure that forces that get created when you go into an MRI are small enough such that you're not harming the patient and that you're not generating heat. And so the big keys there are keeping ferrite and high permeability or permeability materials with permeability above 1 outside of the design of chargers. Something that Resonant Link has spent a lot of time on is keeping that performance high, those same implant depths, that same 20-minute charge, while pulling ferrite out of systems, so that you can get to an MRI conditionally and safe system. So that's absolutely a direction the field's going, and something that we see exists there today with the chargers that Resonant Link is delivering, and others as well. The
kind of needle seems to be moving for us as well at the moment. So I think that devices on the market now that are conditional to 1.5 Tesla MRI. All the major hospitals around the world are busy upgrading their machines to 3 and even 7 Tesla machines, and just because they get clearer images, but it makes our jobs as designers a lot harder as well. So it's a moving landscape.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to the length of the lead, right? So the delivery system is basically a large antenna, and whether you're at 3T, 1.5T, or 7T, it tends to like that length, and so power basically goes out into the tissue on the electrode itself, and that's usually where all the tissue injury happens. And so companies have taken different approaches to try and, kind of reduce that. But at the end of the day, for startups and whatnot, it's an expensive process to go. You may have a device that's compliant or conditional, but to go get that labeling, you have to go run a pretty expensive battery of tests that can take some time and, $500,000 or $1 million, and then you go back and reapply for labeling. But I think unequivocally, as all the other device companies have matured, a patient looks at a device and says, hey, if this is a large implant, but I can get an MRI in my knee if I have problems later, they might choose that as opposed to something that's the latest and greatest that isn't MRI compatible. And so it sort of sets the bar a little higher for market entry on a new device.
Another question here, Michelle, very complimentary of our panelists here today. Michelle, thank you for the question here too. She asks, and forgive my lack of knowledge here, so feel free to jump in. She asks, what about PEMF?
That's pulsed electromagnetic fields. It's another therapy for brain tumors that has seen some clinical studies, some interesting data. It's a slightly different modality to ours. In my view, the clinical data for it isn't anywhere near as strong, and I worry about the kind of off-target effects, because that's a therapy that's potentially damaging of healthy tissues if it's not better targeted.
Another question here too, kind of gets to more of a workforce question, is what are the most sought after skill sets for talent in your teams? USB, Bluetooth, embedded engineers, firmware engineers, software, AI, etc. What have been the hardest skill sets to find?
Hardware designers are hard to find. We're blessed that we have one of those and a firmware designer. But I don't know, in a small team, it's different than a bigger team where I think specific people wear a lot of hats. You might have a firmware guy that needs to write some code to talk to an iPad app or something like that. And so I think the challenges are different in a small team than a larger team. But yeah, as people focus more on, we get 40 resumes of somebody with computational background or data science for every one hardware. I think it's just there's been a shift in what's available.
Within the hardware space, power electronics, embedded firmware, those types of things are niche areas, but places where there's a relatively large talent pool that exists today that serves kind of some of our broader trends, even outside of implantables, like electrification of vehicles and things like that. I think one of the big places that Resonant has had to work hard at is, on the power magnetics side of things, it's a really important in many of the design of different systems, and just a place that there isn't a large pool of candidates out there that are working. You can take wire, wrap it into a circle, and build a coil in 2 minutes, but building one that is going to deliver fast recharges, safe for patients, makes sense in the context of your rest of your system is a fundamental different challenge that there's just not a lot of people in the world that are out there and ready to solve.
We are just about at time here, and I want to go kind of around the horn kind of one last time with some parting thoughts. What's your lasting message to our attendees? And we'll go Bryan, then Chris, and then to Aaron.
I think my thought is, if you deliver energy into the nervous system poorly, then you can never really get it back. So you need it to be effective, not off target. And if you wasted your battery to start with, then you've kind of wasted that energy and that off-target effect. And so We really believe that you've got to nail it at the point of delivery and then work back from the system to miniaturize everything.
I certainly agree with Bryan's final point there. I think the more we do on the biological side and making sure we optimize the effect, the better these devices are going to get. I think we're in an exciting time in terms of the development of some of the hardware and the underpinning technologies for these devices. Bryan's right. We've been in a kind of MySpace era where we've been lagging behind, and I think gradually the new approaches are coming through, and that gives us a lot better tools to work with. So the way I approach design, and I think many people should, is that the key is to get an effective product to market as quickly as you can. That's fundamental for any device, and ultimately we're treating unmet healthcare needs here, so there's kind of almost a moral imperative to that. But then we've got to be agile to adopt new technology as it comes available quickly, and to improve these devices quickly, and that's where your kind of sustainable competitive advantage is going to come from. And I think historically something we've not been great at in medical devices, where you stick with something that works, and we just see lower kind of speed of innovation compared to some other industries.
Aaron, I'll give the final word to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big conclusions kind of walking away from this and hearing the other panelists think is that kind of, building a great device and having the type of impact that all of us came into this industry to have is really about combining having a fantastic therapy that's solving a problem with a product that has a really low patient burden so that they can go about living their own lives. And if you can pair those two things together, you're going to grow the pool of patients that your product can serve. You're going to grow your market share and grow the broader pool in general. And so when I think about a new device or taking my device to the next level, I think it's really about combining those two things. And if you can do that really effectively, you can build a great product.
Well, I want to thank each of you, Aaron, Chris, and Bryan, for your insight and your expertise here today. Really appreciate you taking the time and your thoughtful answers too. I think this has been a great discussion. I also want to thank Aaron. I want to thank you especially for your partnership here with Medical Alley and Resonant Medical. We're very proud of this connection and looking forward to many more opportunities in the future. So thank you once again to the three of you. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in here for the last hour. Thank you again for actively choosing to be with us here today, and have a great rest of your day.